Caleb Rowan was abandoned at the age of 15 and had no family, house, or second chances. Despite being anticipated to disappear, he walked alone into the mountains, bearing a hidden thought that specialists later pronounced impossible. When the hardest winter in years hit, one question changed everything. Would his strange shelter save or bury him alive? What would you have done at 15? Give up or risk your life on a design that no one believed in? Tell me in the comments. Let's explore the mountains and the stories of Zayli Ancient Shelter. Cascade Mountains in Washington State, September 1952. While every builder in Chelan County was erecting the identical square cabins their grandfathers had built, 15-year-old Caleb Rowan was carrying salvaged lumber up a mountain road toward a plot of property that no one wanted, planning to make something that had expert carpenters scratching their heads in surprise. The boy who had been booted out of his foster home with just a canvas bag and $17 intended to build a triangle-shaped dwelling. Not a triangular roof, as was traditional, but a cabin with walls that formed a steep A-frame rising from the ground at acute angles to meet at a ridge beam high overhead. There are no vertical walls. Instead, two sloping surfaces lean against each other like a deck of cards. That is not a house. Noted elderly Gunnar Erickson at the hardware store in Leavenworth, the tent is composed of wood. The first hard snow will crush it flat, along with the boy within. But Caleb Rowan had spent 3 years observing, listening, and remembering everything his grandfather had taught him during those brief summers in Alaska before his death. And his grandfather had taught him that the structures that weathered the worst winters were never those that battled snow. They were the ones who let it slide right immediately. If you want to figure out what transpired when the coldest winter in 15 years tested that strange triangle cabin, subscribe to our channel and let me know where you're watching from, because the numbers from that winter silenced every man who had sneered at Caleb Rowan. Caleb had suffered loss earlier than most youngsters should. His parents died in a vehicle accident on Stevens Pass when he was 7 years old. Their pickup trucks went off an ice road during a January storm, tumbling 300 feet down a slope. Caleb had been staying with a neighbor that weekend. A little compassion that saved his life, but condemned him 2 years of trying to figure out what he had lost. The state put him with his mother's uncle, Bernard Rowan, a commercial fisherman from a tiny village on the Alaska coast. Bernard wasn't a warm person, but he was honest and realistic, and he taught Caleb what he knew. How to read the weather by examining clouds and winds. How to work with wood using hand tools that need technique rather than strength. How to see that nature was not an enemy to be vanquished, but rather a force to be cherished. And, when practical, channeled, Bernard died of a heart attack when Caleb was 11, after fainting on his yacht during a usual maintenance check. Caleb was moved again by the state, this time to a foster family in Washington, a couple named the Hendersons, who took in children mainly for the monthly state payments. The Hendersons weren't nasty in outward ways. They provided food, housing, and the required surveillance to satisfy social workers. They did not convey affection, care, or any sign that Caleb was more than a financial calculation. Caleb survived for 3 years by being invisible. He attended school, did his tasks, and spent every spare moment in the little town library reading books about construction, engineering, and ancient northern building methods. He researched how indigenous Alaskans designed shelters to resist conditions that might kill unprepared strangers. He researched how Scandinavian settlers adjusted their construction ways to significant snow loads. He studied the mathematics of angles and tensions, as well as the science of heat transport. The Hendersons took no note of this. They merely remarked that Caleb was calm, did not cause any problems, and would soon age out of the foster care system that furnished them with income. Mr. Henderson informed them too, weeks after Caleb's 14th birthday, that they were leaving for California and that Caleb would not accompany them. The state would finally locate another placement for him. In the interim, he was allowed to stay with a neighbor until the paperwork was finalized. Caleb understood what it meant. Another odd family, another residence where he didn't fit in. Another group of people might tolerate his existence until it became inconvenient. He made a different decision. He collected the $17 he had earned from odd jobs and packed his canvas bag with the few possessions that mattered, and walked out of town before daylight, traveling east toward the mountains and a plot of property he had discovered during a school field trip 2 years previously. The site was a small clearing on a steep mountainside at over 4,000 feet elevation, accessible only via a Forest Service path that saw only a dozen hikers each year. It was technically owned by a mining firm that abandoned its claims during the Depression and never bothered with the paperwork to sell. The county had confiscated it for delinquent taxes years ago, but there were no purchasers for a steep, rocky site with no road access and a reputation for hard winters. The land had gone unclaimed for more than a decade, forgotten by everyone but a 15-year-old youngster who grasped its potential the moment he saw it. The clearing faced southeast, collecting morning sun and enabling passive solar heating during the winter months. A tiny spring sprung from the rocks above the site, supplying year-round water. The neighboring forest was abundant with timber. The steep slopes on 3 sides created a natural windbreak from the prevailing storms. Most significantly, the environment meant that any structure built there would encounter the same challenge that wrecked most mountain construction: snow loads capable of collapsing a conventional roof in a single strong storm. Caleb had been studying this topic for 2 years. He'd filled notebooks with equations, pictures, and notes. He had read everything in the library about alpine construction, from Swiss chalets to Alaskan cabins to traditional mountain shelters from around the world. He had concluded that the solution was not to build a thicker roof to withstand the snow, but to construct a shape that rendered the snow irrelevant. The A-frame design was not novel. Variations have existed for ages in frigid regions around the planet, but the precise geometry Caleb aimed for carried the notion beyond what most builders considered practicable. His roof angle would be 60 degrees from horizontal. Snow couldn't pile on such a steep hill. No matter how much fell, the design would effectively be all roof, with no vertical walls to absorb wind or sustain snow loads. The triangular cross-section would be intrinsically stable, with one angled wall bracing the other and dispersing forces throughout the structure rather than concentrating them at weak places. Caleb arrived at the clearing after 2 days of hiking, using trails and game tracks to avoid roads where people may question a 15-year-old going alone. He set up camp in the clearing and spent a week simply observing, just as his grandfather had instructed him. He noticed where the sun rose and set, how shadows moved across the countryside, and where water drained during a light shower. He calculated the direction of the prevailing winds by monitoring how branches moved and debris piled. He examined the existing trees, their growth patterns showing decades of weather history preserved in wood and bark. Only after this observation period did he start designing the actual construction. The A-frame would measure 24 feet long and 16 feet wide at the base, with roughly 200 square feet of floor space on the main level and a sleeping loft above. The walls would rise at a 60-degree angle, meeting at a ridge beam 12 feet above the floor. He would need roughly 40 main timbers for the structure, plus hundreds of smaller pieces for sheathing, flooring, and interior work. He had no money for mill lumber. He would have to harvest and process every piece manually, using hand tools and procedures that predated power technology by centuries. The job began with picking and felling trees. Caleb used standing dead timber where feasible, wood that had already dried and would not shrink or distort as it cured. He selected trees of uniform diameter between 8 and 12 in that would provide the structural parts he needed. Using a crosscut saw he had found abandoned at an old logging site and fixed with files taken from the Henderson garage, he felled trees one at a time, limbed them, and carried them to the building site using rope and leverage, techniques his grandfather had demonstrated. The labor was terrible. A 15-year-old body was not intended for this effort, and Nate's muscles shouted protest every night as he dropped into tired sleep. His hands blistered, then bled, then slowly acquired calluses. He lost weight he could not afford to lose. His already slender physique grew haggard as he expended more calories than his meager food supply could restore. He ate wild berries, caught fish from a nearby stream, and carefully rationed the modest amount of rice and beans he had transported from town. September moved into October, and Caleb pushed himself harder, knowing that the first heavy snow could arrive any day. Word of the boy on the mountain reached Leavenworth through the informal network of hunters, hikers, and Forest Service workers who moved through the backcountry. The stories looked implausible at first. A child building a cabin alone at 4,000 feet with no power tools, no supplies, and no adult supervision. Some folks assumed it was hyperbole. Others expected the child would give up and come down before the weather grew severe. Gunnar Eriksson, who had been building cabins in the Cascades for 43 years, heard the stories and decided to see for himself. He told folks he was going to check on his deer shooting areas, but his actual route took him directly to the clearing where the weird construction was purportedly happening. What he found made him stop at the edge of the trees and look in silence for about 5 minutes. The A-frame skeleton stood virtually complete, its steep angles rising against the October sky like something from a geometry textbook. The joinery was not professional, but it was sound. Notches had been carved with accuracy, pegs had been driven with care, and the entire structure exhibited a unified grasp of stress and force that Gunnar had rarely seen in self-taught builders. The child himself was perched at the top of the frame, wrestling a ridge beam into position using a rope and pulley system that Gunnar recognized as an ancient forestry technique. He was little for his age, skinny, and weathered, but he walked with the steady efficiency of someone who has learned to preserve energy. Gunnar watched him work for several minutes before shouting out, "That beam's going to slip if you don't reset your anchor." The boy looked down, surprised, but not afraid. He observed the elder man for a time, then looked at his pulley anchor, then back at Gunnar. "How should I reset it?" It was not a challenge or a test. It was a real query from someone who wants to learn. Gunnar felt something shift in his chest, an awareness of something he had not expected to discover on this mountainside. He set down his pack and climbed up to help. Gunnar Eriksson spent 3 days at Nate's building site. He had planned to stay only a few hours to satisfy his curiosity and perhaps offer some basic advice before returning to town. Instead, he found himself teaching everything he knew about timber frame construction to a 15-year-old who absorbed information like dry wood absorbed water. The boy's design was sound, Gunnar admitted to himself, more sound than he had expected. The steep roof angle would undoubtedly shed snow before it could build. The triangular structure was intrinsically stable. The orientation captured morning sun while the surrounding terrain shielded the harshest winds. But there were refinements that only experience could bring. Better joinery techniques, improved methods for weatherproofing, and strategies to build thermal mass that would help manage internal temperature. Gunnar taught all of it, not because he felt sorry for the youngster, but because he appreciated what the boy was attempting. On the 3rd day, as Gunnar prepared to leave, Caleb posed the question that had clearly been brewing throughout their time together. "Why are you assisting me?" Gunnar considered the question seriously. "Because you're not asking anyone to do it for you. You're not waiting for someone to save you. You're solving the problem yourself with what you have." He shouldered his pack. "That's rare enough in adults. In a boy your age, it's worth supporting." He dug into his pocket and brought out a little roll of cash. "This is for supplies, not charity. Alone, you can pay me back when you're able." Caleb glanced at the money but did not reach for it. "I don't know when that will be. Neither do I. That's not the point." Gunnar placed the dollars into Nate's hand. "The point is that what you're developing deserves to be finished. By what you can't make. Let me know if you need more." He walked away down the trail without looking back. When Caleb counted the money that evening, he found nearly $60, more than he had ever held in his life. The money altered everything. Caleb conducted a carefully planned excursion to Leavenworth, acquiring only what he could not reasonably produce himself. Nails, a small glass window for passive solar gain, roofing felt for waterproofing, and a tiny cast-iron stove scarcely larger than a coffee can that would serve as his heat source. He dragged everything back up the mountain in many trips, each voyage adding days to his building plan, but getting him closer to a structure that might really survive the winter. October came with the first light snows. Dustings had vanished by lunchtime, but reminded Caleb that time was running out. He labored from first light until darkness made continuous exertion impossible, putting himself past tiredness into a state of grim determination. The roof sheathing went on board by board, each piece cut and fitted by hand. The roofing felt followed, stacked and overlapped to produce a waterproof barrier. The window was built on the southeast face, positioned to capture maximum winter sun. The inside remained rustic, yet functional. Caleb erected a sleeping loft across the back part of the construction, accessible by a simple ladder. Below the loft, he put his little stove with its chimney pipe going through the roof peak. The floor was split logs arranged flat side up, not smooth, but substantial and insulated from the freezing ground by a layer of bark and pine needles. Shelves lined the angled walls, following the slope of the roof, giving storage for his limited goods and the food supplies he was slowly accumulating. The Ephraim's most distinctive feature was its inside thermal design. Caleb had arranged a collection of huge stones around the base of his stove, rocks he had carried from the neighboring stream and dried in the autumn heat. These stones would absorb heat when the stove was burning and release it slowly over hours, providing warmth long after the fire died. The steep ceiling condensed warm air at the sleeping loft level while chilly air settled near the floor. On cold nights, the loft would be the warmest point in the structure, naturally heated by rising air without requiring extra fuel. November approached with a severity that signaled winter's genuine intentions. The temperature dipped to freezing and stayed there. Snow began falling, not in dustings, but in constant accumulations that would have horrified anyone in a typical cabin. Mate watched from inside his A-frame as the white blanket covered the world outside, and he watched with particular attention as that same snow hit his steep roof and immediately slid off, unable to find purchase on the 60 slope. The first real test came during the third week of November. A storm system stalled over the Cascades, dropping nearly 4 feet of snow in 3 days. Wind gusts exceeded 50 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally and creating drifts that buried everything in their path. Trees cracked and fell throughout the forest, their branches overloaded with frozen weight. In Leavenworth, 2 buildings collapsed under snow loads. A family in a cabin near Lake Wannock had to be rescued by helicopter when their roof began to fail. Nate's A-frame stood untouched. The steep angles that everyone had mocked performed exactly as he had calculated. Snow hit the roof and slid immediately to the ground, building up in drifts along both sides of the structure, but never accumulating on the roof itself. The wind that would have torn at vertical walls found nothing to grip on the aerodynamic shape. The structure actually created a small area of calm at its entrance. The sloping walls redirect airflow up and over rather than allowing it to blast directly at the door. Inside, Caleb maintained his fire and monitored his thermometer. Outside temperature during the worst of the storm dropped to -5°F. Inside, near the stove, the temperature held at 48. Up in the sleeping loft, where warm air naturally accumulated, it was 56. These were not comfortable temperatures by normal standards, but they were survivable. More importantly, Caleb was burning only small amounts of wood, perhaps 15 pounds per day, compared to the 50 or 60 pounds that conventional cabins required in similar conditions. Gunnar Eriksson had been thinking about the boy on the mountain throughout the storm. When the weather finally broke in late November, he made the difficult trek up the trail, half expecting to find the A-frame collapsed and the boy frozen inside. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. The structure stood solid and sound, its steep roof clear of snow, while the surrounding trees groaned under white burdens. Smoke rose from the chimney pipe in a thin, steady stream. The drifts along the sides of the building had actually provided additional insulation, banking against the lower walls like natural buttresses. Caleb opened the door before Gunnar could knock, having heard his approach through the frozen forest. The boy looked thinner than before, but his eyes were bright, and his movements showed no sign of the desperation Gunnar had feared. "Come in," Caleb said. "It's warmer inside." Warmer was relative. Gunnar's breath still fogged in the interior air, but compared to the bitter cold outside, the A-frame felt almost comfortable. He studied the interior with a carp's eye, noting the stone thermal mass around the stove, the efficient use of the triangular space, and the way the sleeping loft captured rising heat. "How much wood did you burn during the storm?" "About 45 pounds total," Caleb said. 3 days. Gunnar did the math in his head. 15 pounds per day. His own cabin, a conventional design with good insulation, burned at least 50 pounds daily during cold snaps, and it rarely stayed as warm as this strange triangle. The steep roof that everyone had mocked was part of the answer, but not all of it. The shape, Gunnar said slowly, working through the logic. The hot air rises to the peak, but there's nowhere for it to go. It pools at the top and radiates back down, and the stones hold heat for hours after the fire dies. Caleb added, I can let the fire go out at midnight, and the loft stays above 40 until morning. Gunnar sat down on the small bench near the stove and looked around the structure with new understanding. This was not just a shelter built by a desperate boy. This was a considered response to a specific set of problems designed by someone who had studied the challenges and developed solutions that addressed each one systematically. Word of the A-frame's performance during the November storm spread through Leavenworth with the speed of small-town gossip. By December, Gunnar had brought 3 other builders to see the structure. Each of them was skeptical until they stood inside and felt the warmth, saw the clear roof, and heard the numbers that defied their expectations. The reaction was not uniformly positive. Some men felt threatened by the implication that a 15-year-old boy had solved problems that had plagued mountain construction for generations. Others dismissed the design as a trick that would fail under different conditions. A few simply could not accept that their way of building might not be the only way, or even the best way. But others listened and learned. A younger builder named Thomas Whitfield asked Caleb dozens of questions about the geometry, the angles, and the thermal design. He filled the notebook with sketches and calculations, adapting the principles to his own upcoming project. An older Finnish immigrant named Paavo Machinen recognized the design's kinship with traditional Northern European structures and shared techniques from his own heritage that Caleb incorporated into refinements throughout the winter. The worst test came in January. A cold snap descended on the Cascades that shattered records dating back to territorial days. The temperature dropped to -30 and stayed below -20 for 11 consecutive days. Streams froze solid. Wildlife died in the forest. In town, pipes burst, cars refused to start, and the hospital treated dozens of frostbite cases. 2 elderly residents died in homes that could not maintain survivable temperatures despite continuous heating. Caleb Rowan, alone at 4,000 feet in a wooden triangle he had built with his own hands, not only survived but also maintained interior temperatures that never dropped below 42. He burned more wood than usual during the worst nights, perhaps 25 pounds per day. But his supply held easily. The stones around his stove proved their worth, absorbing heat during burning periods and releasing it steadily through the brutal nights. The sleeping loft, that simple platform tucked against the roof peak, stayed above 50, even when the main floor dropped into the low 40s. When the cold snap finally broke, Gunnar made another trip up the mountain. He brought supplies, this time food and fuel, and a new pair of boots that he claimed to have found on sale but that fit Nate's feet perfectly. He also brought news. The county had officially abandoned any interest in the property where Caleb had built. The land was essentially unclaimed, and if Caleb wanted to file a proper homestead claim when he turned 18, Gunnar knew a lawyer who would help with the paperwork for free. More immediately, Gunnar had talked to several families in town who needed construction work done. Simple jobs at first, repairs and additions, but paying jobs that would provide income and build a reputation. You know more about building for this climate than most men twice your age, Gunnar said. Time to start getting paid for it. Caleb considered the offer carefully. He had not thought beyond survival, beyond getting through the winter. The idea of a future of work and income and a legitimate place in the community felt strange and unfamiliar. I don't have any credentials, he said finally. No training, no certification, nothing official. Gunnar laughed, a rare sound from the serious old builder. Boy, you built a cabin that maintained 50 when it was 30 below outside. You did it alone with hand tools at 14 years old. That's more credentials than half the licensed contractors in this county. He stood and looked around the A-frame one more time. Credentials are what you show when you can't show results. You have results. Everything else is just paperwork. Spring came slowly to the mountains. Winter retreated in grudging stages that gave way to mud, then wildflowers, then During the long, bright days of summer, Caleb expanded his cabin, adding a small workshop lean-to against one side where he could work on projects during bad weather. He took the jobs Gunnar sent his way, starting with simple repairs and gradually working up to more complex projects as his reputation grew. He repaid Gunnar's loan in full by August, though the older man initially refused to accept it. "That money was nothing compared to what you've taught this community," Gunnar said. But Caleb insisted debts were meant to be repaid. That was how trust was built. The A-frame design spread through the region over the following years. Thomas Whitfield built the first copy in 1954, a larger version with some modifications that suited his family's needs. Pavel Buchanan built another in 1955, incorporating finished design elements that improved the thermal performance even further. By 1960, there were 11 A-frame structures in Chelan County, all of them direct descendants of the triangle cabin that a 15-year-old boy had built with salvaged lumber and desperate determination. Caleb himself continued to refine the design. He experimented with different roof angles, finding that 55 worked nearly as well as 60, while providing more usable interior space. He developed improved methods for integrating thermal mass using not just stones but water containers that held even more heat per pound. He created detailed plans that he shared freely with anyone who asked, never charging for knowledge that might help someone survive a mountain winter. The county finally processed Nate's homestead claim in 1958 when he turned 20. The paperwork had been complicated by his status as a minor when he first occupied the land, but Gunnar's lawyer friend had navigated the bureaucratic maze with patient persistence. On the day the claim was approved, Caleb stood outside his A-frame and looked at the official document that declared him the legal owner of 40 acres of mountainside that no one else had wanted. He was 20 years old. He had been living on this land for 6 years, surviving winters that killed unprepared adults, building a structure that engineers later studied and architects later copied. He had arrived with $17 in a canvas bag. He now owned property, operated a successful construction business, and had taught dozens of people techniques that had improved their lives and safety. That evening, Gunnar Eriksson hiked up for what had become his regular monthly visit. They sat outside as the summer sun set over the Cascades, drinking coffee and watching the light fade from the peaks. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd stayed in town?" Gunnar asked. "Gone into the foster system like they wanted?" Caleb considered the question. "I think about it sometimes. I don't think I'd be alive." It was not self-pity or drama. It was a factual assessment of probabilities. The foster system had not been designed for boys like Nate, boys who needed purpose and challenge and the chance to build something rather than simply exist within structures others had created. The mountains had given him what the system could not, a problem worthy of his abilities and the freedom to solve it. "You proved them all wrong," Gunnar said. "Everyone who said you couldn't do it. Everyone who said the design was foolish. Everyone who thought you'd freeze or give up or fail." Caleb shook his head. "I didn't prove anything to them. I proved something to myself. That's different." He looked at the A-frame, its steep angles dark against the fading sky. "They can believe whatever they want. The building doesn't care about their opinions. It just works." Caleb Rowan lived in his original A-frame until 1987, when he finally built a larger home nearby for his wife and children. The original structure became a workshop and guest cabin hosting visitors who came from increasingly distant places to see the design that had started a regional building movement. Architects from Seattle, engineers from California, and even a delegation from Norway came to study the structure and interview its builder. Caleb welcomed them all, answering questions with the same patient thoroughness that Gunnar had once shown him. He never patented the design or tried to profit from its spread. When publishers approached him about writing a book, he declined, saying that knowledge about survival should be free to anyone who needed it. When universities offered him honorary degrees, he declined those too, uncomfortable with credentials he had not earned through formal study. What he did accept was the quiet respect of a community that had learned to trust his judgment. When young people came to him for advice about building or about life, he gave it freely. When families struggled through hard winters, he helped without being asked. When the county finally updated its building codes to recognize A-frame construction as a legitimate design category, they named the relevant section after him. Though he had not requested the honor, the principles Caleb developed in that desperate first winter have since appeared in structures around the world. The A-frame design is now recognized as one of the most efficient shapes for snow country construction. Its steep angles and triangular stability are validated by engineering analysis that confirms what a 15-year-old boy figured out with notebooks and observation. Passive solar orientation, thermal mass heating, and the strategic use of interior geometry to manage heat are now standard features of energy-efficient design. The original A-frame still stands today, maintained by Nate's grandchildren as a family retreat and historical site. Its hand-hewn timbers show the marks of the tools that shaped them over 70 years ago. Its steep roof still sheds snow exactly as designed. On the coldest winter nights, when the temperature drops below zero and the wind howls through the Cascades, the little stove still heats those river stones, and the sleeping loft still stays warm enough to survive without burning the mountain bare. The lesson of Caleb Rowan's triangle cabin extends far beyond construction techniques. It speaks to the human capacity for solving problems when survival depends on finding answers. Every expert told Caleb his design would fail. Every experienced builder knew that cabins had vertical walls and that roofs could not be that steep, and that 15-year-old boys could not build structures alone in the wilderness. They knew these things because they had always been true. What they did not know was that truth can change when someone desperate enough, or smart enough, or stubborn enough decides to question the assumptions everyone else accepts. Caleb succeeded because he refused to accept that the conventional way was the only way. He studied the problem from first principles, understanding the actual forces involved rather than simply copying what others had done. He recognized that fighting nature was less effective than redirecting it, that a roof that let snow slide was better than a roof that tried to hold snow up. He understood that survival in extreme conditions require designs optimized for those conditions, not designs optimized for normal conditions that might also work when things got hard. So here's the question for you. What conventional wisdom in your own life have you accepted simply because everyone around you accepts it? What steep angles might solve problems you have been trying to address with vertical walls? And what knowledge dismissed by experts who have never tested it against genuine necessity might actually save your life if you trusted it enough to try? Caleb Rowan was 14 years old, abandoned, penniless, and alone. He built a triangle when everyone else built squares. He built steep when everyone else built shallow. He built alone when everyone said he needed help. And when the worst winter in 15 years came to test every assumption the experts held dear, Caleb Rowan was warm and alive and proved right. While the conventional cabins groaned under snow loads, their designers had assured everyone they could handle. That is not just a story about architecture, that is a story about the courage to think differently when your life depends on finding a better answer. If this story resonated with you, if it made you reconsider what you thought you knew about building survival or the value of questioning assumptions, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things by trusting their own understanding when everyone else said they were wrong. Because sometimes the smartest thing you can do is build a triangle when everyone else insists on squares.